On the Tendai calendar, yesterday, the 4th of June, is the commemoration of Sangye, also called Chogoe or Jogoe. The former name literally means the assembly of Sangye Daishi, which is another name for Dengyo Daishi Saicho. So this day then is the official memorial for our Japanese founder, Master Saicho. The second name of Chogoe or Jogoe means lecture assembly. And this second name arose because lectures, particularly on the Lotus Sutra, are conducted on this day in memory of great Master Saicho. For as he advised shortly before his passing, if there are those of like mind, they must preserve the way, cultivate the way, reflect on it, and depend on it. In other words, if we are of like mind, then we must follow in his footsteps and seek what he sought. With a mind to clarifying what it is that he sought then, I will offer this very short discussion on two very important fundamental questions. That is, what is Buddha-Vacana and what is Buddha-Dharma? This brief discussion is undertaken in memory of Master Dengyo Daishi Saicho in the hopes that others will follow in his footsteps, but it will not be an all-encompassing, exhaustive study. Buddha-Vacana literally means the speech of the Buddha or the words of the Buddha. This term has, from the earliest period of Buddhist history onwards, been linked in meaning to another term, that is Buddha-Dharma, and that term of course implies the teachings or doctrines of the Buddha in this context. On first learning these words, it's easy to assume that their definitions are simple enough to be straightforward. We surmise perhaps that Buddha-Vacana is what the Buddha actually said verbatim perhaps, as if that was self-evident. Or we might preferentially use the term Buddha-Dharma, taking it to be less restrictive than the former, and including perhaps that which is consistent with the words the Buddha actually said. But it's sometimes hard for us as Western Buddhists to hear terms like these and not fall back on our own cultural baggage. In the Western world, we take for granted certain Christian concepts, for example, and we can end up applying them to our understanding of Buddhism unconsciously. Seeped in 2 millennia of this Christian heritage, we as a culture have been taught that all scripture is divinitus inspirata, that is, all scripture is God-breathed, or theopneustos. Now, of course, passages like that come with their own exegesis, but it's almost as if we come to Buddhism with an unwritten default position, and that is that there's a distinction between the divinely inspired on the one hand and the words of men on the other. We have, as it were, an inbuilt sense of the gap between these two. In the English-speaking world in particular, we might also unwittingly carry a particularly Protestant understanding of this divine inspiration. This would be something along the lines of scripture alone, or sola scriptura, as sufficient or certain or infallible for every good work. Now, I'm of course not suggesting that we bring these ideas to our investigation of Buddhism willingly, but rather that we carry them along unwittingly. And the danger in this is that it can colour how we approach terms like Buddha-Vacana and Buddha-Dharma. And whatever opinion we might personally hold on the definitions of these two terms, I think we would do well at the very least to locate our understanding of these terms among the plethora of positions that have been debated by the Buddhists of the past. A second and equally dangerous pitfall, inasmuch as it can distort our consideration of Buddha-Vacana, is the idea that this is a Mahayana versus Theravada debate. In other words, we might have this idea in our mind that there is a non-Mahayana position, which is straightforward and very conservatively defined on the one hand, this being represented by the Theravada tradition in our own day, and then on the other, there is a far less strict position, which is being proffered by the Mahayana and runs the unique risk of dissipating the Buddha's message beyond recognition. What I'd like to do today is suggest that we need to be on the lookout for our cultural assumptions on the one hand when we consider how to define Buddha-Vacana and Buddha-Dharma respectively, and on the other hand, though I'll make no attempt to be exhaustive in my coverage, I hope also to show that the orthodox positions of most Buddhist schools paints a far more complex picture than the Mahayana versus Theravada paradigm might suggest. Before I get into considering some of the positions advanced by Buddhists traditionally, I'd like to start with a disclaimer, specifically as to my own tradition. I am a traditional Tendai Buddhist, which means that I take the non-Mahayana, the Mahayana, and the Tantric canons to be both Buddha-Vacana and Buddha-Dharma. My thought on these matters is naturally informed by my tradition, just as my thoughts on Buddhism are conditioned by my former Christian heritage. But I appreciate first and foremost that the Dharma is to be discerned, and so in this video I will naturally not be restricting myself to my own school's position, nor my own opinion specifically. Even if you hold a different opinion from my own on the matter of what constitutes Buddha-Vacana and Buddha-Dharma respectively, I hope you'll appreciate from this brief discussion how important it is that we as Buddhists reflect on these two questions, that is, what is Buddha-Vacana and what is Buddha-Dharma? Because if we do not first ask those questions, we can hardly seek what the masters of the past sought, because we have no measuring stick with which to measure. And on that note, it's worth making sure that we're familiar with another important set of Sanskrit terms, which will help us navigate our way through the various positions we'll consider and act as our measuring stick. Traditionally, there have been three kinds of pramana. That is, means by which valid knowledge of Buddha-Dharma and Buddha-Vacana can be ascertained. The first one is called pratyaksha, or direct perception, and this is none other than experiencing awakening ourselves. An example of which would be the Buddha's own awakening. It's worth mentioning at this stage too that there are levels of awakening which would be describable as direct perception, but are not necessarily as lofty as that of the Buddhas. So I'm thinking here specifically of the levels of attainment of the Arhat. The second kind of pramana is called anumana, or inference. That is, discovering Buddha-Dharma and Buddha-Vacana indirectly by a process of yukti, or reason logic. And the third kind of pramana is aptagama, that is scriptural teaching or scriptural reference. In other words, taking precedent from the tradition and the words of the Buddha specifically. The first of these three means of valid knowledge, that is pratyaksha, is direct, and therefore it's the goal of all Buddhist practice, regardless of school. But in the absence of direct perception, we are able to acquire valid knowledge of Buddha-Vacana and Buddha-Dharma indirectly by either inferring something based on reason and example, or by confirming it in the Buddhist scriptures. Now that we've covered the basics and also familiarized ourselves with the fundamental ways of measuring or defining Buddha-Vacana and Buddha-Dharma, we can look at positions advanced by particular schools and communities. It's important to bear in mind the fact that although the Theravada tradition is the only non-Mahayana tradition extant in the world today, there were historically many non-Mahayana traditions who each possess their own understandings and injunctions on the meanings of Buddha-Vacana and Buddha-Dharma respectively. What's more, the non-Mahayana traditions of the Abhidharmikas, specifically schools like the Sarvastivadans, were far more influential historically than the Theravada, even though they're no longer with us. Let us first take a look at the Dirghagama, or longer Agama sutras of the Dharmaguptaka school as preserved in the Chinese. Here we find an interesting account wherein the Buddha outlines four great dharmas, or Mahapadesha. The account walks us through four possible sources of information regarding the Buddha-Dharma, and gives us instruction on how we ought to adjudicate whether or not the content of such information is Buddha-Dharma. Now the four sources of information on Buddha-Dharma presented here are as follows. 1. that which is claimed to have been heard from the Buddha directly. 2, that which is claimed to have been heard from the consensus of the community. 3, that which is claimed to have been heard from a number of bhikshu. And 4, that which is claimed to have been heard from a single bhikshu. Now straight away we should notice that these indirect sources are already being admitted tacitly as possible sources of Buddha-Dharma. This includes cases wherein someone claims to have heard something from the Buddha directly, but which we have only heard second-hand. In all of the 4 cases here, the method for adjudicating whether or not what has been heard is Buddha-Dharma is exactly the same. Let us look at the first source of information to get an idea of this adjudication process. If there is a bhikshu who says thus, "O Venerables, I was in such and such a village, or such and such a city, or such and such a land, and I myself heard this from the Buddha directly, and so I accept this teaching." Those who hear this should neither accept nor reject what has been said, but should conclude its veracity or falsity against all the sutras, and by relying on the Vinaya and by relying on the Dharma, you should investigate it thoroughly. If it is not of the sutras, not of the Vinaya, and not of the Dharma, then you ought to say to him, "The Buddha did not say this, and you have accepted this in error." Why is this? By relying on all the sutras, relying on the Vinaya, and relying on the Dharma, I have determined that what you have said is not compatible with the Dharma. O Venerable One, do not accept this, do not expound it to others, and you ought to discard this. If, however, what he said is reliant on the sutras, reliant on the Vinaya, and reliant on the Dharma, then you should say to him, "What you have said is truly what the Buddha has said," i.e. Buddha-Vacana. Why is this? By relying on all the sutras, relying on the Vinaya, and relying on the Dharma, I have determined that what you have said is compatible with the Dharma. O Venerable One, you should accept and uphold this, expound it broadly for others, and must be careful not to discard it. In short, the criterion by which we assess whether something is Buddha-Dharma and Buddha-Vacana is not whether we heard it directly from the Buddha verbatim, but by comparing it against 3 things: all the sutras, the Vinaya, and the Dharmas. Now, some debate could be had on what specifically the Dharmas refers to. Putting it aside momentarily, the other 2 items of the sutras and the Vinaya are very clearly the third kind of pramana, or valid means, which we looked at before. That is specifically aptagama, or scriptural reference. Dr. Donald Lopez concludes in his book Elaborations on Emptiness that this position, quote, effectively sanctions only those doctrines and practices already accepted. But if this is the intention of the injunction here, we might expect to see it using language a little bit more forceful than, quote, "What you have said is compatible with the Dharma." We also might conclude, if we're reading it this way, that the third, as yet unknown item, i.e. the Dharmas, would be redundant here. In fact, this wording and the inclusion of a third item speaks not to sanctioning merely what has been said before, but also that which is found to be compatible with, but perhaps is not explicitly addressed in the earlier material. And it's in this vein that we might come to appreciate what this third measuring stick, here called the Dharmas, might refer to. We saw that our second form of valid knowledge was anumana, or inference, which we described as discovering something indirectly by a process of valid reasoning. Could this be what is meant by, quote, relying on the Dharmas? Indeed, if we encounter something for which we do not have a direct reference in the sutras or the Vinaya, our next best bet is to determine whether the information being presented follows from those sources. In other words, can we infer it from the scriptures? It's quite possible indeed that this instruction was understood to be determining via compatibility, as commentarial material on similar passages here posit the Abhidharma, i.e. the reasoning out of the sutras and Vinaya, as the reference here. And so if we take a strict textual view of this injunction, we end up with something like Buddha-Vacana is that which is compatible with the Tripitaka, that is, the three collections of the sutras, the Vinaya and the Abhidharma. If we take a less textual view, we appear to have the two pramana, that is, aptagama or scriptural reference and anumana or inference. In either case, this injunction is a fairly conservative way of determining what constitutes Buddha-Vacana and Buddha-Dharma respectively, but perhaps not in the way we might have suspected. In neither case is Buddha-Vacana restricted to what has left the mouth of the Buddha simpliciter. It conservatively limits the measuring stick with which we might confirm or deny its compatibility. Indeed, if it is found to be compatible, then we are to say not just that it's Buddha-Dharma, but, quote, what you have said is truly what the Buddha has said. Is this really that conservative? It doesn't just say that what you have said is compatible with, or even what you have said is Buddha-Dharma, it states plainly that, quote, that which you have said is truly Buddha-Vacana. This might be quite a liberal position if our experience with religion has been some form of divinitas inspirata, or the idea that scripture is God-breathed. But some of the reasons why we couldn't limit Buddha-Vacana to that which has come from the Buddha's mouth per se becomes clear as soon as we consider this for any length of time. For example, if we were to become quote-unquote red-letter Buddhists and discard as insufficient those things said in sutras by people other than the Buddha, we would be left with little more than half dialogues and obscure discourse. And so we should consider ourselves incredibly lucky that even at the conservative end of the spectrum, Buddha-Vacana is not simply what has come from the Buddha's mouth per se. We find the almost identical injunction in the Digha Nikaya of the Theravada school, absent the third item. It reads as follows: suppose a monk were to say, friends, I heard and received this from the Lord's own lips. This is the Dhamma. This is the discipline. This is the Master's teaching. Then, monks, you should neither approve nor disapprove his words. Then, without approving or disapproving, his words and expressions should be carefully noted and compared with the suttas and reviewed in light of the discipline, i.e. the Vinaya. If they, on such comparison and review, are found not to conform with the suttas or the discipline, the conclusion must be, assuredly this is not the word of the Buddha, it has been wrongly understood by this monk, and the matter is to be rejected. But where, on such comparison and review, they are found to conform to the suttas or the discipline, the conclusion must be, assuredly this is the word of the Buddha, it has been rightly understood by this monk. This is the first criterion. If we were right in supposing that the third and missing item, i.e. the dharmas, implied inference or anumana, we might take from this, that is its absence, that the Theravada school only accepts aptagama or scriptural reference as a valid form of knowledge. But when we look a little bit deeper and a little bit more broadly, we find that the Theravada position is far more complicated than this. For example, the Theravadins hold that the 7 canonical Abhidhamma texts of their tradition were spoken by the Buddha verbatim. In their Vinaya, for example, we find the following: Angirasa, the Shakyan sage, compassionate for all beings, the best of all creatures, the lion, taught the 3 Pitakas, the Sutantas, i.e. the sutras, the Abhidhamma, i.e. the Abhidharma, and the Vinaya, a great special quality. They say that this Abhidhamma was then passed via the disciple Shariputra to the Theravadan monastic community to this day. Now it needs to be noted here that there is certainly a trend among contemporary Western Theravadan monastics. I'm thinking of individuals such as Bhikkhu Bodhi, Bhikkhu Sujato, Ajahn Brahm, for example, who deny that the Abhidhamma texts of their tradition were spoken verbatim by the Buddha. And they do this based on contemporary scholarship. But it needs to be kept in mind that this is not the orthodox position of the Theravada tradition more broadly, nor has it been the stance of this tradition throughout history. Indeed, given that a large part of our discussion today is on valid forms of knowledge, it must be said that in distancing themselves from the position of their school on this matter, they presumably also deny the validity of the pratyaksha, or direct perception of their own arahants, as they were the ones who formulated that position. This would leave them perhaps only with Abhidharma, or scriptural reference, as a valid form of knowledge, and certainly if they're taking a historicist perspective on this matter, a very slim picking of scriptural reference at that. In any case, this is not the position of the Theravada tradition. These then are their personal conclusions as distinct from their scriptural injunctions, the direct perception of their arahants, and of any inference that could be derived from those two sources. In any case, the fact that the Theravadins have traditionally maintained that the entirety of their Abhidharma is Buddha-Vacana verbatim is quite a significant point, especially considering that many of the other schools that also have Abhidharma consider those texts to be both Buddha-Vacana, but also the compilation of later disciples. Finally, it's worth noting that the ostensibly conservative Theravada tradition includes texts such as the Dhammapada in their Khuddaka Nikaya, that is, as part of their Sutta Pitaka. You might wonder why this is worth noting in the context of our discussion of Buddha-Vacana. Well, anyone who has ever read the Dhammapada will have probably noticed that it's an anthology of sayings attributed to the Buddha, preserved in verse. It's therefore by necessity a compilation of later disciples, which brings together components of the Buddha's words from across the canon. Therefore, it is not a specific dialogue by the Buddha spoken verbatim by the Buddha at a particular juncture. This must mean then that the Theravadins traditionally maintained these works as Buddha-Vacana because they trusted the pratyaksha, or direct perception, of the arahants who compiled those texts on the Buddha's behalf. Now, not all Theravadin masters throughout history have accepted texts like the Dhammapada as Buddha-Vacana, and we need to note that. Venerable Sudina, for example, is said to have remarked, "There is no word of the Buddha which is not a sutta." Nevertheless, it's not nothing that the orthodox Theravada tradition characterizes texts like the Dhammapada and the Jatakas as Buddha-Vacana. There were other schools which were more conservative on this issue and on the Abhidharma. Even here then, defining Buddha-Vacana and Buddha-Dharma is not merely a matter of determining what the Buddha said, how he said it, and the way in which he said it. The most historically significant non-Mahayana tradition is undoubtedly the great Vaibhashikas of the orthodox Sarvastivada school. They are responsible for the greatest wealth of Abhidharma material ever produced, even though they were more conservative than the Theravadins when it came to the nature of the Abhidharma. They state the following about their Abhidharma Pitaka. Given that apart from the discernment of dharmas, dharma pravichaya, there is no supreme method capable of extinguishing all of the afflictions, and it is due to all of the afflictions that the great ocean of birth and death churns, on this basis they say that the Buddha expounded the Abhidharma, desiring that the world be capable of discerning the dharmas. Separated from this exposition of the Abhidharma, the disciples would be incapable of determining the truth amidst all the dharmas and their characteristics. However, the Buddha World-Honored One expounded the Abhidharma here and there, and so the Bhadanta Katyayani Putra, along with all of the great Shravakas, established the Abhidharma texts by compiling them together. Just as the Bhadanta Dharmatrata compiled the Impermanence chapter to make the verses of the Udana Varga, so too do they say that the Vibhasha masters were also like this. This means that the Sarvastivadins believe that the Abhidharma was not spoken by the Buddha verbatim, but that the Buddha expounded the Abhidharma piecemeal throughout his ministry. Therefore, The texts of the Abhidharma were not authored by the Buddha himself, but by his disciples who compiled them together into unified works. This is in sharp contrast to the Theravada position we saw, which maintained that the works themselves were the Buddha's word verbatim. But notice something even more important about this admission from the Sarvastivadins. We're told that without the works of the Abhidharma, we would not be capable of extinguishing the afflictions. And since that is the goal of Buddhism, of Buddha-Dharma itself, then in a very real sense, the Sarvastivadins are implying that the Buddha-Vacana par excellence is not to be found in the sutras directly, but in the works of the Abhidharma compiled by the disciples for that very purpose. For the Sarvastivadins then, the Abhidharma is indeed a product of the disciples, but it is a product made on the basis of the Buddha's direct words. They point out that which is compiled on the basis of the Buddha's words would also constitute the Buddha-Vacana, or the speech of the Buddha. And more strongly, they point out that if that which the Buddha spoke in the sutras could be distilled or purified in the treatises compiled by the disciples, then these words of the disciples are the supreme authority, the supreme pratisharana. They are the last resort, over and above the sutras spoken verbatim by the Buddha. In unambiguous terms then, the Sarvastivadins are claiming that the real Buddha-Vacana, or the real speech of the Buddha, is that which is composed by the disciples from the greater breadth of the canon. We may not want to make such a strong argument for the words of the disciples, but we have to ask ourselves, is this really all that different from the suggestion we found in the first account of the Dharmaguptaka's Dirghagama? We saw there that if we compared something reportedly derived from the Buddha's own words with the contents of his own words in the sutras and Vinaya, we could on that basis label it as Buddha-Vacana. How much more so could we label it Buddha-Dharma? Now we have the Sarvastivadins here saying that the work of the disciples is Buddha-Vacana too, if it develops from that same source. Indeed, if it is representative of the distillation of the essence of the Buddha's words, then it is the Buddha's words, the Buddha-Vacana par excellence. But that's not all. Looking a bit closer at the excerpt above, we also see a second modification to the Theravada position. That is, on issues regarding works such as the Dhammapada. We were told that the Abhidharma was compiled by the disciples in the exact same way as the Vedanta Dharmatrata compiled the Udana Varga. Now the Udana Varga is a work related to the Dhammapada. Both of them are compilations based on verse. In short, then, the Sarvastivadins agree with the Theravadins in claiming that both the Abhidharma and works like the Dhammapada or Udana Varga are Buddha-Vacana, but they come to that conclusion for very different reasons. The Theravadins hold that both are Buddha-Vacana because they were spoken by the Buddha verbatim. The Sarvastivadins, on the other hand, admit that in both cases these works are compilations, but if compilations are done carefully and properly, then a compilation is also Buddha-Vacana. The uniqueness of the Sarvastivadin position is that they go further. They claim that these works of the disciples are Buddha-Vacana in a very special way, perhaps even more special than the way that the sutras are Buddha-Vacana. In his Nyayanusara, the Sarvastivadin master Samgabhadra makes all of this very unambiguous. He says, if the Buddha had not spoken the Abhidharma, then Shariputra and all the other great Shravakas would not have been capable of determining the truth amidst all the dharmas and their characteristics. Therefore, the Abhidharma, which is the fundamental authority for this treatise, is without doubt Buddha-Vacana. He also says because all of the great Shravakas compiled the Abhidharma in accord with the Buddha's noble teachings, the Abhidharma is that which has the approval of the Buddha and can be referred to as Buddha-Vacana. We should not skip over the fact that Samgabhadra refers to the Abhidharma here as their fundamental authority, or pratisharana. We have here from the Sarvastivadans a very strong and unambiguous argument for all three forms of pramana, or valid means of knowledge. Pratyaksha, or direct perception, in the form of the capacity of the compilers to rightly deduce in their compilations. Anumana, or inference, in the ability to work through issues implied but perhaps not spelled out explicitly in the sutras and Vinaya, and aptagama, or scriptural reference, in that they maintain all of this as possible only via the Buddha's own pronouncements. Now, it does need to be made clear that there was certainly a school, or perhaps more accurately a movement, which challenged the force with which the Sarvastivadans elevated the Abhidharma. The Sautrantika are so called because they rely on the sutras. Sautra and sutra are cognates here. Their highest authority was the sutras themselves, and so they were referred to as sutra pramanika. In his Nyayanusara, Samgabhadra says the following about their position. The Sautrantika master says, they say, to reveal here that he does not believe that the Abhidharma is Buddha-Vacana. What are his reasons for not believing? Because it has been reported that it was compiled by the Venerables Katyayaniputra and so forth, and because the Buddha did not explicitly say that the Abhidharma was a reliance or authority, that is pratisharana. So that Sautrantikas say that the sutras are their reliance or authority, pratisharana, rather than the Abhidharma. And they say this for two reasons. First, because the sutras are the pronouncements of the Buddha verbatim. And secondly, because when the sutras speak of the Abhidharma, they do not explicitly refer to the Abhidharma as an authority, or pratisharana. We might see in this a very strong argument for aptagama, or scriptural reference, as the only valid means of knowledge. And so here finally we might think that we have a tradition that takes Buddha-Vacana to mean what the Buddha said verbatim. It's tempting as well, perhaps for many contemporary Western Buddhists who take a more historicist view on the formation of the canon, to feel a kinship with this position. And it does indeed resemble the position found in many online forums and sites, certainly more so than any of the other positions that we've looked at so far. But there were very good reasons why this position was not held by everyone. It comes with a few glaring issues that we would do well to consider. In the Nyayanusara, Samgabhadra points out that to claim that the sutras alone are our authority, one would have to find explicit reference in the sutras themselves, singling out the sutras as the only authority. If we cannot do this, then our theory of sutras alone is our own exegesis and not based on the sutras themselves. One would then in fact have two authorities, the sutras and their interpretation. That is, aptagama, or scriptural reference, and anumana, or inference. These two are precisely what the Sarvastivadans posit. That is, that we have the sutras and we have the distillation or the inference from their content preserved in things like the Abhidharma. Anyone who has studied the polemics of the Reformation will perhaps notice that this is the same kind of challenge which is laid at the feet of the Protestant reformers, in particular in regards to their doctrine of sola scriptura. We are just seeing this debate in the Buddhist sphere approximately 1,000 years earlier. Before looking specifically at some Mahayana responses to determining Buddha-Vacana, it's a good idea for us to take a quick look at a school known as the Bahushrutiya. The main primary text of the Bahushrutiya school, as preserved in the Chinese canon, is a work known either as the Satyasiddhi Shastra or the Tattvasiddhi Shastra. In that work, we read the following. Buddha-Dharma refers to that which is spoken by the Buddha, that which is spoken by the disciples, that which is spoken by transformative beings, and that which is spoken by all the gods. To say this in summary fashion, those words in all the worlds which are wholesome are in their entirety Buddha-Vacana. So the passage starts by making it clear that Buddha-Dharma and Buddha-Vacana are synonyms. It then goes on to say that what defines Buddha-Dharma and Buddha-Vacana is not the speaker. And then finally, the Bahushrutiyas make the most broad of claims, that is, those words in all the worlds which are wholesome are in their entirety Buddha-Vacana. Now we might want to quibble a little bit on what constitutes wholesome, but in the context of the text it makes it very clear that that which is wholesome is that which is conducive to liberation, as opposed to conducive to samsara. If we were concerned on the misapplication of this term, that is wholesomeness, in order to define Buddha-Vacana, we might try to pull this back a little bit by pointing out that the first half of the sentence made clear that Buddha-Vacana comes from four sources, that is the Buddha, the disciples, transformative beings, and the gods. On that basis, we might read this passage as not altogether too different from the original passage from the Dirghagama of the Dharmaguptakas we saw, which made clear that Buddha-Vacana comes from multiple sources. The Satyasiddhi Shastra goes further a few pages later, however, and says the following. The Buddha said, "You all should not merely believe my words, but must yourselves reflect on it to determine that this Dharma is reasonable and this is not reasonable. This is not like the non-Buddhists who instruct their disciples by saying, 'Do away with such questions and answers, and like a person who washes off the unpleasant dirt and grime, you should be as if deaf and as if dumb, and merely follow my words.'" The implication here is that the Dharma is not merely about parroting the words of the Buddha. That much is quite clear. And we have a much more forceful case here than we've seen thus far being made for the first pramana or means of valid knowledge, that is pratyaksha or direct perception. The disciples must not merely follow the Buddha's words, but must themselves reflect on it. Taken in conjunction, it seems that we have broadened the definition of Buddha-Vacana and Buddha-Dharma significantly. Toward the end of the Satyasiddhi Shastra, we get an explicit reference to what the Bahushrutiya school does with their canon of Buddha-Dharma, and it's quite interesting, to say the least. The Satyasiddhi Shastra reads as follows. First, I should read and recite the sutras, Vinaya, Abhidharma, Kshudraka Pitaka, and the Bodhisattva Pitaka. Unlike the other models we've seen then, which divide the canon into three baskets or a tripitaka of sutras, Vinaya, and Abhidharma, the Bahushrutiyas have a five-fold canon, and it consists of a Sutra Pitaka, a Vinaya Pitaka, an Abhidharma Pitaka, a Kshudraka Pitaka, and a Bodhisattva Pitaka. We've already seen how the first three collections of Sutra, Vinaya, and Abhidharma might be accepted as Buddha-Vacana in our exploration of the other schools. But what about the other two, that is the Kshudraka Pitaka and the Bodhisattva Pitaka? Well, the Kshudraka Pitaka is a special and distinct collection which contains all of those grey area works that we've seen before, such things as the Dharmapada, the Udana Varga, the Jatakas, and so forth. These texts, as we saw, are technically Buddha-Vacana, they're the words of the Buddha, but they were compiled by the disciples from various places. We see that by setting these texts in their own special collection, rather than merely including them in the Sutra Pitaka, as for example the Theravadins do, the Bahushrutiyas are definitely agreeing that these are Buddha-Vacana, while at the same time acknowledging that they are of a different sort to the sutras themselves. And finally, the Bahushrutiyas have that fifth collection, which they call the Bodhisattva Pitaka. And these are those texts which we would today call the Mahayana Sutras. Now, we need to make clear here that the Bahushrutiya are not a Mahayana school, and yet this strongly suggests that the Bahushrutiyas accepted the Mahayana texts, at least some of them, as Buddha-Vacana. We might wonder endlessly in what way they thought the Bodhisattva Pitaka was Buddha-Vacana. Nevertheless, it's clear from this and the various opinions that we've looked at that determining Buddha-Vacana and Buddha-Dharma is not a Mahayana versus non-Mahayana debate. There are already evidently numerous ways of considering what constitutes the words of the Buddha. We've seen multiple definitions now of Buddha-Vacana, and we've even seen ostensibly non-Mahayana schools which accepted a Bodhisattva Pitaka. What's more, we've seen that for obvious reasons the historicist position, so commonly seen online, that Buddha-Vacana is synonymous with the earlier strata of sutras, is of course not found among the traditional schools. In fact, though we've looked at 5 distinct schools now, we've seen a remarkably consistent understanding of Buddha-Vacana and Buddha-Dharma. That is, the Buddha-Vacana is not limited to that which the Buddha expounded explicitly, and on that basis that the valid means to determine Buddha-Vacana are therefore pratyaksha or direct perception, anumana or inference, and abhidharma or scriptural reference. To get a sense of a standard Mahayana position on these questions, it's quite useful for us to look at a very interesting section from the Panchavimshati Sahasrika Prajna Paramita Sutra, that is the Perfection of Wisdom Sutra in 25,000 lines. Therein we find the following episode. Thereupon the Buddha told Prajnajiva Subhuti, "You ought to teach all of the Bodhisattva Mahasattvas the Prajna Paramita, as all the Bodhisattva Mahasattvas should be endowed with this Prajna Paramita." At that time, all of the Bodhisattva Mahasattvas, the great disciple Shravakas, and all of the gods and so forth, had this thought: will the Prajnajiva Subhuti expound the Prajna Paramita for the sake of all the Bodhisattva Mahasattva by means of his own power of wisdom or with the power of the Buddhas? So we have the Buddha telling the Arhat Subhuti that he should teach all of the Bodhisattvas something called the Prajna Paramita, or the perfection of wisdom. But we need to be awake to some of the moving parts here. First, the Bodhisattvas are higher in wisdom than the Arhats, and so this obviously raises the question of how the Arhat Subhuti could teach those higher than himself. Secondly, the Prajna Paramita, or the perfection of wisdom, is that which only the high-level Bodhisattvas and the Buddhas themselves can know personally. And this makes unambiguous the rather strange situation wherein the Buddha is instructing the Arhat Subhuti to teach those higher than himself and to teach something which he himself has not perfected. After all, we've seen that one of the means of valid knowledge is pratyaksha, or direct perception, and this is decidedly something which Subhuti should not be able to develop direct perception into. In very simple terms, teaching the high-level Bodhisattvas and deeply knowing the Prajna Paramita, or the perfection of wisdom, is that which only the Buddhas themselves can do, for they have had pratyaksha, or direct perception, of Prajna Paramita. And so when the Buddha asks Subhuti to do these things, we need to notice that the Buddha is asking Subhuti to teach in his place. The Buddha is passing his teaching authority from himself to a disciple. And yet we might wonder how this could occur without his direct perception of it himself. Naturally, the audience is also quite confused about how Subhuti could teach such lofty things to such lofty individuals. And this is why they are led to ask, Will the Prajna Jiva Subhuti expound the Prajna Paramita for the sake of all the Bodhisattva Mahasattvas by means of his own power of wisdom or with the power of the Buddhas? In other words, they are confused as to how Subhuti could teach them with his own limited powers of wisdom, and so they wonder if the Buddha is going to use his supranormal powers to bestow upon Subhuti the Buddha's own powers of wisdom, that is, the power of his own direct perception. The passage continues. The Prajna Jiva Subhuti, knowing that which all of the Bodhisattva Mahasattvas, the great disciples, and all the gods thought in their minds, spoke to Prajna Jiva Shariputra, saying, "The Dharma which is expounded by all of the Buddha's disciples, and that which they themselves impart, is all by means of the Buddha's power." At first glance, it looks as though Subhuti has confirmed their suspicions and told them that all of the disciples in teaching the Dharma are given the special power of the Buddha's direct perception. This of course, to ensure that they expound the Dharma correctly. But the rest of Subhuti's response is hugely significant and turns this whole understanding on its head. The Dharma which the Buddha expounds and the Dharma expounded by the disciples is not in contradiction with each other, for these good sons study this Dharma and attain realization of this Dharma. The speech of the Buddha is like a lamp. Subhuti has said that the disciples always rely on the power of the Buddhas when they expound the Dharma, but he then goes on to explain what he means by this here. That is, that provided that the disciples, here referred to as these good sons, have studied this Dharma and thereby attained realization of this Dharma, then their Dharma is not in contradiction with the Dharma expounded personally from the mouth of the Buddhas themselves. And to make sure that we've got the message quite clear, we're given a beautiful analogy. The speech of the Buddha is like a lamp. A lamp or a candle flame can be used to ignite many lamps or candle flames elsewhere, and the original lamp is never exhausted or extinguished by doing this. And so it is made crystal clear to us that the speech of the Buddha is like a lamp, in that it ignites in his disciples their own light, which lights up the world in the exact same way as the original lamp of the Buddha. All of these lamps, or candle flames, are the same, and all of the disciples who have studied the Buddha's Dharma and attained realization of it, when they then speak it into the world, are speaking Buddha-Vacana, or the speech of the Buddha. We must notice, of course, that this is not free rein, as it were. The disciples and descendants of the Buddha are only speaking Buddha-Vacana when they have studied this Dharma and attained realizations thereby. And if this has occurred, then, quote, "the Dharma which the Buddha expounds and the Dharma expounded by the disciples is not in contradiction with each other." That is, we can compare what they have to say with the scriptures of the Buddha and see no contradiction between them, even if that which they have said is not an explicit statement made by the Buddha in the scriptures. This whole section of the Panchavimshati is very clever in its reworking of those three valid means to determine Buddha-Vacana. Remember, of course, those were pratyaksha, or direct perception, anumana, or inference, and aptagama, or scriptural reference. We are still reliant on these three sources to determine the veracity of the disciples' and the descendants' claims, but these no longer mean what they did before. If the Dharma is worth anything, then it's worth something as the vehicle of liberation. And if it's really capable of liberating, then there is no difference between the teachings of the Buddha and those of his own wise disciples and descendants, for they too have had direct perception. And so when Subhuti says, "the Dharma which is expounded by all the Buddha's disciples and that which they themselves impart is all by means of the Buddha's power," he's pointing out that just as a candle or lamp can be used to light other lamps, the Buddha's direct perception is used to enlighten the direct perception of his disciples. The speech of the Buddha is like a lamp, and just as a lamp is lit by another lamp, it thereby receives the light of that original lamp, for how could it ignite itself by its own power? If it could do so, then we would see candles and lamps spontaneously igniting all over the place. And in this sense, Subhuti is saying that he is always relying on the power of the Buddha, for he has transmitted that light to him. We have here now the removal of a large portion of ambiguity about what is spoken by the disciples. Don't get me wrong, we're certainly to check what they have said against what the Buddhas themselves have said in the sutras, and indeed, to do that properly, we must be in possession of very extensive knowledge of these scriptures indeed, in order to make sure that they have been enlightened by the Buddha's direct perception. But their pronouncements are not to be mere repetitions of the Buddha's words. We are to investigate the claims of the disciples against the Buddhas, but if we find that they are indeed without contradiction, then we are to say, as the Dharmaguptakas advised, what you have said is truly what the Buddha has said. Simultaneously, we are to hearken to the Bahushrutiyas when they say that the disciples are not merely to believe my words, but must themselves reflect on it to determine that this Dharma is reasonable and this is not reasonable. And so if we should therein find that which is congruent with, but does not merely parrot the words of the Buddha, we are to say, almost in the same vein as the Sarvastivadans, that because all of the great Shravakas compiled the Abhidharma in accord with the Buddha's noble teachings, the Abhidharma is that which has the approval of the Buddha and can be referred to as Buddha-Vacana. In his commentary to this sutra, known as the Mahaprajnaparamita Upadesha, or the Dajratulun, the greatest sage of the Mahayana, Nagarjuna, says the following about Buddha-Vacana, as if bringing together the components thus far considered. The Buddha-Dharma is not merely that which is spoken from the mouth of the Buddha, for in the world all good and true words, the profoundly sublime and wholesome words, all of these come from the Buddha-Dharma. It is just as the Buddha said in the Vinaya, what is Buddha-Dharma? Buddha-Dharma is that which is spoken by 5 kinds of person. First, that which is spoken directly from the Buddha's mouth. Second, that which is spoken by the Buddha's disciples. Third, that which is spoken by the sages. Fourth, that which is spoken by the gods. And fifth, that which is spoken by transformational beings. Furthermore, as the Buddha told Kaushika in the Sutra of Shakro Devanam Indra Attaining the Way, in all the world, words which are true and good, words which are profoundly sublime and wholesome, all of these come from my Dharma. And just as it says in the verses in praise of the Buddha, all that is well spoken in the world comes entirely from the Buddha-Dharma. Well spoken, without error, and unsurpassed are the words of the Buddha. Although good and unsurpassed words can be found elsewhere, all of these, without exception, are remnants of the Buddha-Dharma. Within the paths of all the non-Buddhists, they lay out wholesome words, but this is like when an insect chews into the wood and it comes to resemble a letter. The beginning, middle, and end of their teachings contradict with each other, as if one could draw gold from out of iron, and so who could believe them? This would be like Goshirsha sandalwood being produced from Eranda trees, or like bitter seeds producing sweet and beautiful fruit. Someone who could believe all of this nonsense could also believe that the wholesome words in the texts of the non-Buddhists were produced by them. All wholesome and true words are in their entirety produced by the Buddha. This is just as the best sandalwood incense is produced on Mount Malaya. Outside of Mount Malaya, there is nowhere else which produces the best sandalwood. In the same way then, apart from the Buddha, there is nowhere else which produces words of truth. What's more, the words, "Thus have I heard," are spoken by Ananda and the other great disciples of the Buddha, because they are characterized as having entered the Buddha-Dharma, and so what they recite is also to be referred to as Buddha-Dharma. And now finally, for members of my own Tiantai Tendai tradition who would like to get a firm understanding of how our own school interprets these matters, I'll now attempt to provide some useful components which build upon the various models we've already seen. Shortly before his passing, Master Zhiyi gave a series of lectures which would come to make up his final work, the Guanxinlun. At the beginning of that text, Master Zhiyi says the following about himself, and most crucially, the content of his teachings. Not only am I a shallow and common worldling, but I've heard little and seen scant. Nevertheless, I yearn to help the parrots to flap their wings, and so by exclusively employing the power of the three treasures, I wish to compose this treatise. Eagle-eyed viewers, of course, will have noticed that this is just like the Panchavimshati Sutra, wherein Subhuti was asked to take the place of his teacher, the Buddha, and expound the perfection of wisdom. At that time, Subhuti said that everything that he would expound would all be by means of the Buddha's power. Master Guanding also nods his head to this understanding when he describes Master Zhiyi lecturing in the place of his teacher Master Huisi at the beginning of the Moho Zhiguan. There, Guanding says the following: "This calming and contemplation, which Tiantai Zhizhe expounded, is the Dharma gate of cultivation which he practiced in his own mind. When Zhizhe was born, radiance filled the room and in his eyes appeared double pupils. He cultivated the repentance rite of the Dharma Flower Sutra and generated dharani, i.e. perfect retention of the content. And he lectured upon the golden-lettered Prajna Paramita Sutra in the place of his master." First, it's no coincidence that the sutra upon which Master Zhiyi lectured, and for which he took over the role of his master as the teacher, is the Prajna Paramita, or if we write the name in full, the Panchavimshati Sahasrika Prajna Paramita Sutra, from which the reference to Subhuti was taken. We need to be aware of a few things here. First, Master Zhiyi claims that he's relying on the power of the three treasures and not his own, and it's therefore by measuring the Dharma which he expounds against the Dharma expounded by the Buddha that we can determine the veracity or otherwise of his teachings. What's more, the very fact that he's willing to rely on their power implies that he's confident that by doing so, the Dharma which he expounds and the Dharma expounded by the Buddhas will not be in contradiction with each other. It's by relying exclusively on the Dharma, which has been transmitted to us, that we are able to likewise expound Buddha-Vacana. And it's in that space where one feels themselves totally effaced that this occurs. Second, the very fact that Guanding recounts how Master Huisi had Master Zhiyi teach this particular sutra in his place, just as the Buddha had Subhuti teach the Bodhisattvas in his place, is evidence that Master Huisi had given his seal of approval to Zhiyi and was willing to vouch that it was not in contradiction with the Buddha-Dharma and was therefore Buddha-Vacana too. This is recognition of the congruence between Zhiyi's teachings and the scriptures of the Buddha. We will remember that it's precisely one of the valid forms of knowledge, specifically Abhidharma, or the scriptural referencing, that is being hearkened to here. Furthermore, Master Guanding, who is imparting these teachings he received from Master Zhiyi, again in the place of his master, makes clear that the content being relayed is also, quote, the Dharma gate of cultivation which he, Zhiyi, practiced in his own mind. In other words, it is that which Master Zhiyi himself perceived directly during his training on Mount Dasul, and this of course is the first of the valid forms of knowledge, pratyaksha, or direct perception. It's because of these two proofs being satisfied, that is, pratyaksha or direct perception, and Abhidharma or scriptural reference, that Master Yuanzhao compares the Buddha, what the Buddha taught on Vulture Peak with the teachings of Master Zhiyi that he realized at Mount Dasul. He acknowledges this when he says in the preface to the Shaozhiguan, that which great Master Tiantai Zhiyi perceived in person on Vulture Peak was the transmission of shamatha and vipassana, and his sublime awakening on Mount Dasul was the realization of this shamatha and vipassana. In fact, it was Master Huisi himself who first suggested this congruity of those two proofs being met when Master Zhiyi had perceived directly on Mount Dasu, because Master Huisi said at that moment that it was in days of yore on Vulture Peak that we together heard the Dharma Flower Sutra expounded, and drawn by the conditions of the previous lives, you've now returned. But our tradition does not merely hold that these two proofs, of course, alone are enough, but that all three ought to be present. It'll be remembered that the missing means of valid knowledge is anumana, or inference, that is, teachings that are discoverable by a process of yukti or reason logic. The only way to prove this particular proof without reference to the other two proofs is to infer an idea which is not explicit within the scriptures themselves, but which can be shown to be that which the Buddha himself expounded. In his Zhiguan Yili, Master Janran is responding to critics from outside of the Tiantai school who say that Master Zhiyi's teaching of the three truths or the three contemplations is not to be found in the scriptures. In response to these critics, Master Janran does not at all deny that the terms are nowhere to be found explicitly in the Buddha's words. Instead, he responds as follows. Moreover, the fundamental tenets of the three contemplations, but not the names, are derived from the diadem of the Bodhisattva's former deeds sutra, and this is identical to the transmission which will come from the golden mouth of the Mahasattva who is to come, i.e. Maitreya. Therefore we know that the doctrines of our school, the inheritance from the past in the Buddha's sutras, and the Mahasattva to come, all match like the halves of a tally. In other words, Master Janran points out that this is the demonstration of Master Zhiyi's capacity to infer Buddha-Vacana, and therefore that this is one of his demonstrations of the third form of valid knowledge, i.e. anumana or inference. Remember, he said specifically, the fundamental tenets of the three contemplations, but not the names, are derived from the diadem of the Bodhisattva's former deeds sutra. In other words, he's saying that it's indeed true that the term three contemplations, or conversely the three truths, is not a term that appears in scripture. It has to have been inferred by Master Zhiyi. How do we know then that this inference is Buddha-Vacana rather than a mere mistaken notion? That's why Janran points to the fact that the fundamental tenets of the idea are found in the scripture of the Buddha. In other words, it shows that Master Zhiyi's inference is Buddha-Vacana. And on that basis, Janran is confident enough to go even further, and he says, and this is identical to the transmission which will come from the golden mouth of the Mahasattva who is to come, i.e. Maitreya. So now we understand that Master Janran is trying to demonstrate Master Zhiyi's capacity to infer the Buddha-Vacana, and thereby to complete the three forms of pramana or valid knowledge. From that understanding, we now understand why Janran says as follows. Therefore, we know that the doctrines of our school, the inheritance from the past in the Buddha's sutras, and the Mahasattva to come, all match like the halves of a tally. So we can see that our school affirms the three pramana, or means by which valid knowledge of Buddha-Dharma and Buddha-Vacana can be ascertained. Remember, of course, that that is pratyaksha or direct perception, anumana or inference, and aptagama or scriptural reference. We've also come to understand that these three requirements are read through the lens of the account of Subhuti in the place of the Buddha in the Panchavimshati Sahasrika Prajnaparamita Sutra. But we haven't yet established in any meaningful way what this means in concrete terms for things found in the broader canon. For example, does this mean that we hold to something like the Sarvastivadan position, that is the idea that the works of the disciples like Zhiyi are Buddha-Vacana in a very special way, perhaps more so than the sutras themselves? Or do we hold a position a little bit more like the Sautrantikas, that is, that Buddha-Vacana in the sutras verbatim is the pristine authority, whereas the texts written by the disciples are in a secondary position. The Japanese Kegon master Gyonen puts it nicely and succinctly in his treatise on the essentials of the 8 schools when he says the following. The Tiantai Tendai school takes the Dharma Flower Sutra, i.e. the Lotus Sutra, as its fundamental scriptural authority, pratisharana, and with this they distinguish between all of the teachings in the entire ministry of the Buddha, and so in the scope of their doctrinal classification, all of the doctrines are utilized. That is, we accept the entirety of the canon, spanning the entire ministry of the Buddha's preaching, and take the Lotus Sutra as our fundamental scriptural authority, or pratisharana, that is the lens with which we adjudicate among the rest of the canon. The Sarvastivadans took the Abhidharma as their fundamental scriptural authority, or pratisharana. The Sautrantikas took the Sutra Pitaka as their fundamental scriptural authority, or pratisharana. And we in the Tiantai Tendai school take the Lotus Sutra as our fundamental scriptural authority, or pratisharana. In doing this, it's important that we understand that such a move is not an East Asian innovation, as it's often purported to be by other traditions, but a very early and a very Indic means by which to adjudicate across the canon. The Tiantai Tendai school is here demonstrating its congruence, therefore, and its influence in regards to the Buddha-Dharma. Though this is our fundamental authority, we make use of the entire canon at the same time. And we do this because the Lotus Sutra says the following. Shariputra, you ought to know that the words of all the Buddhas are not different, i.e. contradictory. You ought to give rise to great strength of faith in the dharmas which are preached by the Buddha. In the dharma of the world-honoured ones, only after a long time will they preach the truth. In other words, we accept that the Lotus Sutra, on the one hand, is that truth that is only expounded after a long time, and all the other texts of the greater canon represent the words of all the Buddhas, which are not different, i.e. not contradictory. Adding some meat to these bones, Master Janran says the following. Still more so is this the case for the principles we utilize, for we take this Dharma Flower Sutra, i.e. the Lotus Sutra, as the bones of our creed, take the Great Perfection of Wisdom treatise, or the Mahaprajna Paramita Upadesha, as our guide, take the Great Nirvana Sutra as our supporting literature, and take the Great Perfection of Wisdom Sutra, or the Panchavimshati Sahasrika Prajna Paramita Sutra, as our contemplative method. We quote all the sutras to foster one's faith, and quote all the treatises to aid one's realization. Contemplation of thought is our warp, and all dharmas are our weft. We weave all of the teachings together into a single cloth, which is unlike the other traditions. From this, we can conclude simply by saying the following. We take the Lotus Sutra as the bones of our creed. We take the Great Perfection of Wisdom treatise of Master Nagarjuna as our guide. We take the Nirvana Sutra as our supporting literature, and we take the Panchavimshati Sahasrika as our contemplative method. We quote all the sutras to foster the faith of the believers, and we quote all of the treatises to aid one's realization. Contemplation of thought or meditative practice is our warp, and studying all of the dharmas is our weft. In this way, Master Zhiyi has weaved all of the teachings together into a single cloth, which is unlike that in other traditions. We believe that Master Zhiyi was able to do this because he demonstrated congruence with the words of the Buddha before him, and therefore met the aptagama or scriptural reference requirement for valid knowledge. He demonstrated the capacity to infer doctrine not made explicit, which qualifies as the anumana or inference, and he attained direct perception of the truth himself, that is pratyaksha. And for these reasons, we get an understanding of why the Tiantai Tendai tradition praises Master Zhiyi in a way that it doesn't praise most other historical masters that we can call upon. Pulling all of this together and understanding the way in which we view Master Zhiyi's capacity to bring together all of the sutras, all of the treatises around the core of the Lotus Sutra as our fundamental scriptural authority or pratisharana, we get an understanding of why our tradition, refers to Master Zhiyi as both the Shakya of the Eastern lands and the remanifestation of Shakyamuni. In conclusion, if the position of the Panchavimshati resembled the non-Mahayana Sarvastivadins, then the position of Nagarjuna surely resembled the position seen among the non-Mahayana Bahushrutiya school. The positions advanced by both the Mahayanists and the non-Mahayanists we've looked at are remarkably consistent on what constitutes Buddha-Dharma and Buddha-Vacana. So much for a division along the lines of Mahayana and non-Mahayana. Perhaps the most remarkably consistent feature of all of the positions we've discussed is that they do not limit these terms to that which is said by the Buddha alone, while at the same time explaining that it must be derived from that same source. If we're able to walk this line, then we avoid two extremes: limiting Dharma on the one hand to every specific remark expounded by the historical person of the Buddha, or straying far from the Buddha's guidance and shepherding on the other hand. You might choose to ignore all of the positions advanced by Buddhists over the centuries and instead take a more contemporary historicist view to defining Buddha-Vacana and Buddha-Dharma. But if you intend to do so, I would advise at the very least that you're sufficiently humble and sincere enough to investigate what Buddhists have said on the matter over the past 2,500 years before making that conclusion. And most importantly, if you choose to embrace such a position, do not pass it off as the official position of any traditional school. Acknowledge that such a position is your own and let it stand or fall on its own merits. Conversely, for those of us on the other hand, who hold to one or other of those traditional positions, remember that you need not apologize for that position. Know precisely why said position was upheld by bodhisattvas and arhats of the past, and be humble enough to strive always to understand why they came to those conclusions. In short, regardless of where you fall on the spectrum when it comes to defining Buddha-Vacana and Buddha-Dharma, know your reasons and be informed about the positions of Buddhists across the centuries. Don't allow your cultural assumptions to determine how you understand Buddha-Vacana, and rely not on your own power to expound the Buddha-Dharma, but the power of the Buddhas, and like a lamp, light up a corner. Thank you.